The Rings of Power has been a major disappointment. They have created so many new characters and storylines, it doesn't feel like Tolkien's work. They've retconned lots of major items in this world, and journalists are finally catching on, calling out this show for what it really is, a disgrace to a great legacy. I have a few things to show off, but before we get into the topic at hand, if you enjoy the content that I create, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Follow me on social media like Twitter or mine so that you can see when my content is posted. And of course, if you do really enjoy the videos and the live streams that I create, please consider becoming a Dark Titan via Patreon for just $1 a month, or support the channel via YouTube memberships. All of the links are in the description, and of course, I do really appreciate all of the support. So I have a couple of different articles that I want to show off, but I wanted to start with this one on Forbes. It says, "The Rings of Power is making a mockery of Tolkien's work." This article is written by Eric Kane, who has been very critical of Hollywood's new direction and narrative, so it's not one of the Forbes writers who usually defends the terrible content Hollywood is releasing. If someone were to adapt Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings trilogy in the same manner as Amazon is making The Rings of Power, that version would go something like this. Rather than opening on the Shire and Bilbo's party and a visit from Gandalf, and rather tell the tale of Frodo and his companions' fraught departure from their homeland, we would instead be introduced to 4 separate stories in the opening half hour. Now, story in number 1, a fierce hobbit baker woman who encounters an orc and smacks it to death with her rolling pin. Then she'd gather the rest of the Shire to make for a ruined hobbit castle, where she'd rally the hobbits to make a valiant last stand against the nearby ditch-digging orcs led by an evil hobbit. Number 2, Aragorn and a crack team of Gondor rangers would head for Mordor, where they'd soon be captured, but Aragorn would be set free to take a message back to his people, submit to Sauron, or face extinction. Story 3, Galadriel would set out from Lothlorien bedecked in a full plate of armor, and head to Rohan, where she'd make a quick work of Wormtongue and rally the riders of Rohan to war. And story 4 would be Elrond would send Legolas to the Lonely Mountain to enlist the aid of the dwarves, but in reality, he'd have a secret plan even Legolas wasn't aware of, to trick the dwarves into giving them some of the precious jewels that they have. This truly and genuinely is such a great start to an article, because this author is instantly laying out the problems with Rings of Power, just with a story that we all love. Because if they had done this with The Lord of the Rings, and if we had gotten a real Lord of the Rings show and this was the story, it would be terrible. We would be unimpressed. It's not just the Rings of Power that's the problem, it's the way that they've set up the story, the way that they're telling the story, all of these new characters. The show overall is just a mess, and it is very unfortunate, because while Rings of Power, unfortunately, isn't just this, like, love letter to Tolkien's work, I still think with the new characters and new story elements, they could have made it an okay show, as long as they really nailed the parts that were Tolkien. If they had went into this show and didn't market it as, we're sticking to the source material, when they don't have the rights to a lot of source material, so clearly they can't use a lot of it, and they had said, listen, we don't have some of the material, we have to create some new elements, but we're going to try our very best to nail Tolkien's world, I would have felt differently about this show. But unfortunately, they didn't do that. They tried to trick us into watching this show, and it, well, isn't working for them, because we haven't heard any more viewer numbers, but people have rallied against this show since the start. I've written at length about the many problems with the show, from its insufferable central protagonist to its abysmal writing, and I have other pieces in the works about specific issues I have with the show, but I wanted to point out here just how un-Tolkien-like the storytelling itself is. I have done so with humor and exaggeration, but I hope you take my meaning. What we have now with the Rings of Power barely even resembles Middle-earth. It's just a generic Hollywood fantasy created by people who badly misunderstand its source material and don't seem to give a damn. This is a giant problem I have had with the show. It doesn't feel like Middle-earth. It doesn't feel like this world that we've been so excited to see on screen again. Maybe that's what's begun irking me so badly. The show isn't just straying away from the lore, rather, its creators seem to think they know better, that they can do whatever they please with the source material, or that by ignoring it, they can improve upon it somehow. I have been saying this from the beginning, but it does feel like a generic Hollywood fantasy series, and it doesn't feel like a love letter as it should. As you can see, though, clearly Forbes isn't saying they like the Rings of Power, and they're kind of trashing it, but there are other articles that have been released, like this one. Its title is Prime Video's Rings of Power is boring me out of my mind. I also have to agree with this. The show has been very boring so far. So far, the owners of more than 293,000 Twitter accounts have liked a tweet from Tesla CEO Elon Musk that he posted earlier this month, wherein he shared a brutal 6-word takedown for the Rings of Power, and the tweet read simply, "Tolkien is turning in his grave." There was, predictably, a flood of the usual news and bloggy coverage about Elon's tweet, as is always the case. The Elon fanboys whooped, cheering him on. His detractors huffed that he ought to stick to cars and rockets and leave reviewing TV shows to various series people, and of course, Neil Gaiman said that. I'm not going to say whether one or the other is correct, but I'll add this. I've given the Rings of Power's prequel series, set thousands of years before the events depicted in Peter Jackson's LOTR movies, enough of a chance. They go on to talk about how they're giving up on the Rings of Power, and here are some of the points they have for the show, that they, feel pretty much nothing for the characters. The story seems to be, coalescing around a young version of Galadriel, and she came off as badass at first, but now is just one note and super annoying with a borderline messiah complex. The first episode certainly looked great, but the magic quickly wore off, and my interest sank like a stone after that. Unfortunately, there is nothing with this show to keep me going. I just don't want to watch it anymore, truly. I'm going to finish it so that I can fully judge it. Maybe suddenly the last few episodes will be amazing and they'll turn it around, but for a show that has $1 billion shoved into it, I just don't see anything here that makes me go, wow, this is amazing. This feels like genuine Tolkien. And of course, on social media, people have been roasting this show. The review scores have been terrible for it. And this tweet has blown up. Council of the Ring said the Rings of Power is a masterpiece with a clown face. As you can see in the crowd, they even reused several shots of characters. They basically just copy and pasted, figures into the crowd in the scene. And I understand that this was at the height of COVID and that, they had very strict social distancing rules, but you can't tell me, with how much money they have put into this show, that they couldn't get a couple of extra people to stand on a set in front of a green screen and edit them into this shot. Overall, I am very disappointed with this series. I know a lot of you are disappointed with this series, and the media is starting to turn on the Rings of Power as well. But for now, that's all that I really had to discuss in this video. Let everyone know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to give it a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. And of course, if you didn't, make sure to give it a dislike. I appreciate your support either way, but I will talk to you all again in the next video really soon.